Yeah, and you started to get a bit into the monetization bits with buyers. You've probably thought about this a whole lot on all of the different options that you have in front of you for monetization. How would you consider that? Of course, how did you think about it for Heptio? And how do you think about it now going forward if you were to start a new project?
Well, I think looking at Heptio, I think I definitely learned a lot as we've gone through. And I think, my thinking on this has gotten a lot crisper than I think we were kind of fumbling our way through with Heptio, to be honest, in some degree. But I think so. The first thing to recognize is that there's sort of different types of open source. And fundamentally, like, I started out saying what excites me about open source is this community, people coming together. And I think fundamentally, when you look at a project, there's a unspoken contract between that project and its community. And you establish that early on and you set expectations with your community. And as you set those expectations, that defines your degrees of freedom in terms of like, hey, here's the stuff that we're going to be doing to be able to monetize this stuff. And I think one of the worst things that you can do is to, unilaterally redefine that contract with your community as you go. And so I think a lot of the places where we've seen companies struggle with open source is where they've had some implied contract or relationship with their community, and then the situation changes and they're like, we're going to change the license because we need to be able to monetize, or we're going to exert control that we hadn't been exerting before because technically we can do that, but because we haven't done it before and because of some of these sort of statements that we've said, now all of a sudden we're changing that contract with our community. And so I would say that the contract that you have with your community both will influence the growth and the level of ownerships that people feel with your open source project, and it will also, constrain and enable the monetization, motions that you can bring relative that to that open source project. And so I think looking at different types of open source, I think that there's on one end of the spectrum, there's what I would call throw it over the wall open source, where it's like, hey, I'm writing code, but people can read that code. Maybe even it has an open source license, but I'm not accepting any contributions. I'm only interested in a user community. I'm not interested in a collaborative sort of contributing community. And sometimes people will call it open source, even if the license is relatively restrictive as they do that. I think a great example of this would be sort of Android, right? Android is open source. People can take it and do other things with it, as noticed by like the gazillion Android derived phones that, in Far East. But, there's still a core of that is, the fundamental Android experience is tied to Google services. And like, it's very clear that the next version of Android is being enabled by Google, and the set of sort of flowing back into that code base is very, very limited. At the other end of the spectrum is what I would call open community, right? And open governance. And this is what we see a lot with things like projects in the CNCF or the Apache Foundation. This idea where you want projects where the direction and the roadmap of the project is driven by the community itself. And oftentimes you'll see these things be places where multiple vendors come together. There's things like elections for decision makers inside the process. And so it's very much, that community is driving where that thing goes. And I think from my point of view, a healthy sign of a project that is, open governance is that if any single vendor, even the most critical one to that project, if they were to step back and say, you know what, we're not interested anymore, the project would still be viable and would still have a life beyond that vendor stepping back. And so in the middle there, what we have is this emergence of what I would call open core projects, right? And I think this is where I think a lot of folks get, very confused, and there's a lot of companies exploring redefining some of these contracts and looking at this, sometimes to great effect, sometimes by ham-handedly redefining that contract with their community and creating a lot of problems for themselves. And so I think there's a way that we can start slicing this more finely that I think is useful. Uh, Open core, oftentimes what you have is a single vendor driving a project, and they reserve for themselves the right to offer the enterprise edition of that product that has extended features, right? And so if you are a member of that community, fundamentally you can use the open source version, but if you want to contribute to that open source version something that will start to conflict with the enterprise version, they're going to put a stop to it, close the PR, and say no, right? And
Mhm.
we've seen this happen with a lot of companies. Now, where things get really hard is when like the original license had, was very liberal, and then going forward they're going to be changing license for the contributions they're bringing to the project. They still own the trademark. Those are the things that can create a lot of turbulence and can help to really damage communities. Now, slightly on the other side of that is something that, and we're still workshopping the phrasing for this, is what I would call sort of maybe open extensibility. And this is, I think, where we look at where Kubernetes is, where the open source project is open and it's a level playing field. You may set limits into what goes in that project. So if somebody comes with a PR saying we want to add XYZ feature, you may say no, but instead of saying no, it's impossible, you say no, but here's the extensibility mechanisms that you can use to do it yourself, perhaps in another open source project, perhaps in a proprietary thing. So now, as a company, you're sponsoring that open source project, you're building it, you're building the extension mechanisms, you're then using those extension mechanisms to build your commercial products that are complementary to the project. But fundamentally, it's a somewhat level playing field between you and other folks, because those same extensibility mechanisms could be used by your competitors or could be used by sort of complementary open source projects. It's a little bit riskier, but I think it also, from the point of view of business, but also I think it stays true to a lot of more of the sensibilities and the ethos that a lot of your contributor and user communities will be expecting out of that open source project. And so that's, I think, in my mind, the sweet spot is to actually do that open extensibility. But I think it's worth recognizing that there's a whole host of models along that spectrum that really come into play.